One. Hey, welcome to 2024 with Hollie McKay. How you doing, Hollie?
I'm doing well, thank you.
That's great. We're gonna in this video, we're gonna cover the first couple of months of 2024 and the stuff that you've been up to in terms of articles that have appeared on your Substack. I want to start with Iranian-backed militias, which are, a subject that's not really watched in the West as much as it used to be, but it's still there and it's still very
Well, it
much
is
a
now.
cloud.
Now, with everything happening in the Middle East, it's a big spotlight back on these Iranian-backed
Yeah.
militias because, I mean, there are many of them, and they've orchestrated many attacks against US troops in the region, to the point, very sadly, where two US troops were killed and at least 40, if not many, many more, suffering from injuries like TBI that they will have for the rest of their life. So it really has brought the presence of troops back into the spotlight. And this, again, in these attacks have always been there, but they have really proliferated since October 7, since the Hamas attack on Israel.
Yeah. And so I don't think a lot of people are aware, but you've also covered the fact that, there are still US troops in that region and they are in danger each and every day. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and that's become a really sort of big debate in policy circles in DC now, is why we still have 3,000 troops in Iraq and Syria. So you've got sort of roughly around 2,000 in Iraq, and then just under 1,000 who are in Syria. And of course, the official mandate for them being there is to deter ISIS. And that has now come into question because while ISIS will always be there, and they'll probably always have certain insurgent groups around, they weren't, or they aren't, holding any territory. And of course, that they aren't the threat that they were 10 years ago. So that is causing a lot of policymakers and former intelligence officials to say, well, it's just not worth the risk of troops being there. Of course, you could also argue that troops being there, while under the cover of deterring ISIS, are really there to get this information on Iran and to counter Iran in the region, so to speak. So there's a sort of a big debate over whether we should have troops there or not. And there are many pros and cons to both sides of that. And I think it's also important to also recognize that while sort of the Constitution says that Congress should be sort of deciding where we are and where our war presence is across the world, this was never, Congress never sort of approved this. The mandate that Obama was able to use back in 2014, 2015 to resend troops to that region after pulling out at the end of 2011 came from a sort of a post 9/11 emergency declaration by Bush, that anything in the name of counterterrorism therefore meant that the US could sort of send these emergency troops in without that congressional authorization. So if you peel back the onion, there's also that factor of it, and that to a lot of people is quite alarming.
Yeah, but so well, very clear, very clearly there's all this minutia that goes on in the background, and we have those troops in place, and they kind of act as they're a tripwire for us, but with the real threat being Iran and the threat that it poses to the entire region, or the influence that it poses to the entire region, and nothing highlights that more than what Iran is doing in terms of supporting disruptions to stability in the region with the Houthis. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, Iran, of course, has many proxy groups in the region. One of the major ones being the Houthis, and anyone who's been following foreign policy knows that these Red Sea attacks have been going on since November, and they're continuing to go on against ships. And the Houthis, which are a Yemen-based Shia militia group, they, are saying it's sort of their part, the role that they're trying to play in supporting Gaza and Hamas in conflict against Israel, by targeting ships in this sort of major shipping region, and that's causing a lot of concern from many different countries. But of course, the Houthis are quite strong. They have a fairly impressive arsenal. They've managed to hold the capital of Sana'a in Yemen for more than 10 years, despite the Saudis' bombardment and the much more sort of sophisticated air force that Saudis have had, the Houthis have really remained strong in holding that territory. And of course, now they've extended that to the Red Sea, and that is quite alarming. The US has formed a coalition with other countries to kind of push back and deter the Houthis, but that really doesn't seem to be working because the attacks are continuing. And so you could definitely say that Iran has a big hand to play in that, in terms of financial support, in terms of military support. But of course, Iran itself isn't doing the fighting. Instead, it relies on these proxy groups like the Houthis, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, like these Iraq-backed militias. Iran-backed militias in Iraq, like the Badr Brigade and Katib Hezbollah, to kind of do the dirty work while it pulls the strings.
Yeah. Well, so let me extend that just one little bit more, because and this is my perspective as an analyst at this point. I'm seeing this area that there's an experimentation going on. It kind of reminds me of Spain in the 1930s, where you've got all this technology that's kind of crossing swords in these areas through all these proxies that is changing how power projection and warfare is done. And in particular, the experiment at this point that I really see is the viability of navies to project power on behalf of larger nations to keep peace in areas like, starting with the Red Sea, but essentially the things going further. If
Yeah, absolutely.
Iran succeeds, if
Yeah.
Iran succeeds at figuring out the technology to overcome major navies, very similar to the way that the Ukrainians have been quite inventive in terms of coming up with technology to challenge the Russian Navy in the Baltic. Um, uh, have you heard any buzz in terms of the think tanks in DC in terms of like even beginning to deal with the issue of what happens when everything in terms of naval technology starts, if they find a hole through that and start to become effective?
And I think that actually hosted an event last night at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. It's hosted a panel with different experts talking about this. Of course, their stance on it is very pro-Israel, but they're also very much for a very strong kinetic pushback against Iran. And really, that that is also very debatable in policy circles, and particularly within the Republican Party itself, which traditionally was sort of the Ronald Reagan, the sort of strong arm. But now you also have this very strong, and a lot of it is Trump supporters factors that want to be sort of out of these complicated parts of the world, and to really be insular and focus inward. So it comes down to a lot of who has the political power in terms of how much energy is going to be put into any of these conflicts. Uh, and it's very hard to sort of see. I think Biden has sort of tried to have a strong arm, but then the argument is that it's not strong enough because it clearly hasn't done anything. And Iran is continuing to advance in its objective. And this has been going on now for decades. Of course, we do know from his past administration that Trump is very anti-Iran, but whether or not what actions he sort of plans to take on that front, they also remain very murky, depending on how involved the US wants to be, and kind of how that game is played. And I think there's a lot of conjecture, but I don't know that conjecture is particularly useful because we just don't know. We don't know how the US is going to respond, let alone how Iran is kind of going to respond to any of this. And really, a lot of it does rest on what happens next in the Middle East, in the Israel-Gaza war. And I think Israel's made it very clear that it's not going to stop until Hamas is rooted from power, and that's going to require occupation. There is really no other alternative of who's going to govern Gaza if it's not a terrorist organization. So I think we're in this for the long haul, and I think that Iran is in this for the long haul, and I don't think there is any clear answers.
Yeah, well, I think the Middle East is in it for the long haul. I kind of share the concern that the United States may not have the stomach to be there for a
Mm.
long haul and is probably potentially the single biggest source of instability in the equation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again, because the US itself is so sort of divided on the matter and what the right path is, that the division only makes one weaker.
Yeah, well, clearly there's a lot to watch in 2024 and how this continues to probably for the next 3 or 4 years actually, that there's a lot to watch. Now, turning to different stuff. You also kicked off a thing where, for personal health reasons and mental health reasons, as a new mother, resurrected one of the things that I've known that you have long loved, stretching. And
Yeah.
so tell me a little bit more about that whole self-initiative of yours and how you want to share it with the world.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a side fun hustle. The split system. People always sort of ask me the things that I do, the rituals that I have, maybe when I'm working in war zones, when I come home. And so I really had to think, like, what is the consistent part of my life that I do, regardless of where I am and what I'm doing? And I always try to work out. That's something that's very important. But with that, is stretching. And the beauty of stretching is that you can really do it anywhere. You can kind of roll out of bed, you can do it in bed. You could do it at any time of the day. And so that's always been something very consistent in a war zone. Mind you, I have done it and do it. Going for a run can be a lot more challenging, but stretching is something that you could do, and you can do it for 5 minutes, you can do it for 50 minutes, you could do it for 2 hours. It's really sort of up to you. And so that's something that I wanted to share. So I've created a protocol, and I think I come at stretching, probably very differently to, say, a yoga class or a Pilates class or a fitness kind of class. I mean, that is from my ballet background. And so we have such a focus on, lengthening those muscles and really holding those muscles. And so I think over the years, I've been able to really uh, kind of dig down and find what works and what how you can get flexible very quickly and maintain that flexibility. And that's something that I want to share. I think right now it's just sort of one-on-one live classes that people can, if you go to thesplitsystem.com, you can reach out to me and we can set up a time. And there are different packages, and they're usually 30-minute classes. And I have a discount for introductory classes if that's something someone's interested in. Just because I want to be able to work one on one with people. And I think, especially when you're starting something new, it's nice to have that kind of personalized attention on what you want to focus on. But hopefully down the track, I can kind of expand that too into sort of a more group setting or virtual. Being able to sort of tailor the classes to send to people so they could do in their own time. Um, so yeah, I'm always welcome to new people, and please check it out.
Yeah, well, I mean, so yeah, because I've seen you do this for a very long time. When you first told me about it, I go like, so is she gonna like teach people how to stretch on top of buildings in the middle of a war zone and have her selfie take?
Oh,
Because you
probably.
used to do that.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So
Yeah.
I want
I'll
I want to
stretch
end
in
this with,
the most extreme places.
yes, you have, and I have a photo library of archival information stuff to prove it. Um, I want to finish with a story that I've known about for a very long time, but you finally wrote about it, and it's just so charming about the experience that you've had with you know uh, uh, people who have become iconic at the very very early stages of their careers. And you finally wrote about the letter that you got from a very young Taylor Swift recently, and
Yeah.
so I think it's worth sharing. So talk a little bit
Yeah,
more
I
about that.
wanted to I wanted to share a little bit about my early career. Which is very different, obviously, to what I do now. And that was I was based in LA and did a lot of general assignment, but a big part of that was really entertainment. And I had a column and all that stuff. I was, I think, 20 when I got my job at Fox doing that. So it was sort of this baptism by fire of being in this very strange Hollywood world. I don't know that I ever bought into it too much, which was probably why I did quite well at my job, because I never I never, endeavored to be friends with these people or to, but part of what I had to do was go to a lot of events and interview a lot of different people. And it was a really interesting, and this is all sort of pre the explosion of social media. So you couldn't just go on Twitter and see what someone was saying. You had to source it out. You had to go to where they were. You had to develop sources. So it really gave me a terrific training ground for what I do. And I think a lot of people think, oh, you have to go to Georgetown or you have to go and get a master's in international relations at Oxford or whatever it may be to kind of enter this foreign policy realm. And typically, yes, that is the case. But my foray into it was very hard fought in a very different way. So I want to share a little bit about some of those early days and reflecting on that. And I have so many stories, and I wish that I had probably been better about keeping journals of them all, because I look back at them now and some of them are quite funny, but certainly one was, seeing the rise of Taylor Swift. And I think, she was, as I was kind of starting my career in that, she was also just coming onto the scene. And she was this very young, sweet sort of country singer in her boots with the long blonde curly hair. And she had this publicist named Paula who would also always go to the red carpet with a little sign. And like she would hand you sort of a bullet points of Taylor, where Taylor was from, how old Taylor was, the name of her debut album. It was very like, it was very charming and sweet. And would always come and talk to you personally about, could you interview this new client of hers? And I remember at one point she'd asked me to go to sort of a listening concert. And this is when I really hadn't heard of Taylor. I'd maybe seen her a couple of times on the carpets and things. And me and I think it was only one or two other, music journalists showed up to this, and she played a few songs on her guitar, and she was very talented, and these were songs she'd written herself. And anyhow, afterwards she sent a thank you note, for attending. And it's just very sweet. It showed you her very sweet side. And then I would continue to see her over the years. And I think I introduced my dad to her once, and run into her at different events, and she'd always remember the last time that you saw her. Super sweet. She'd always be with her mom. I remember her mom took me backstage at one of her very early country concerts and gave me a big tour. And it was just very endearing when I think about it. And I also remember, I think, one occasion, again, very early in her career, when there was a sort of a fashion reporter next to me on the carpet who asked Taylor, who she was wearing or whatever. And she didn't really know. And then somebody said something, I can't remember the designer now, but it was super mispronounced. And another journalist friend of mine kind of corrected her mom on the, very nicely corrected her mom on the pronunciation. I remember her mom sort of laughed and said, "We don't know about any of this. We're from the South." But anyway, it's great to see her, however you think of her music. It's always nice to see a nice girl like Taylor kind of really become this dominant power in the world. And again, whether you like her music or not, I think she is a good representation for young women. You don't see her out kind of partying at nightclubs or doing all the naughty things that a lot of the pre-post Disney stars do. And I think she's very much kept her head on her shoulders despite this sort of enormous fame and fortune that she's amassed.
Yeah, well, yeah, I love the charm of that story because basically, as I'm a total Swiftie when it comes to my favorite music, and I have to be very careful when we're on long drives not to like I let you take over the audio system of the car, otherwise you'd be listening to Taylor Swift songs for half the drive. But yeah, it's still such a charming story, and I think you're so lucky to have met that girl when she was just at the very beginning of things and nobody really knew who she was yet. And look
Yeah.
what she's become. Yeah. You've seen a lot over the years on that side of your life, and I think it is worth sharing. So, and with that, thank you so much for spending a little time and going over some of the stuff that you've done in terms of the work on your Substack at the beginning of 2024. Let's close out by tell people where your Substack is and where they can find it and why people should read it.
Yeah, mean, please support independent journalism. It's a challenging world out there, so I do my best to try to elaborate on different topics and just kind of enlighten people a little bit about what's happening around the world, both from a policy point of view and also from a very personal point of view. And yeah, your support is really welcome. So it's holliesmckay.substack.com. Please sign up. Of course, paid subscriptions is what keeps it alive. So that is incredibly valuable if you can do that. But as always, thank you for your support and also the split system, thesplitsystem.com, if anyone is interested in stretching.
Okay, very good. Well, oh, do I hear a raven in the background?
Yeah, you hear my baby. She's in the playpen next to me and she loves to sing. She loves music. So I think when we started talking about Taylor, she decided she'd start singing too.
Oh, very good. Well, thanks, Holly, for the time, and then we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Dennis.